Hey y'all, it's been a wet few months here, but with a few sunny days ahead, we're going to take advantage of them and build a knockdown side table. Since I'm going to be practicing more hand-cut joinery with this project, I was going to build this out of pine, but Rockler had these 9-inch wide white oak project boards on sale, so we're going to go with those. These boards do have a few knots and blemishes, but that'll be fine with this practice piece. The top of this side table is going to be 20 inches long, so after marking it out, I cut the board with my Rayova saw. Around halfway through the board, I noticed I was drifting to the right quite a bit, so I switched to the other side to try and close out the cut on the line, but that one also started drifting to the right away from the other cut. I finished it off with my Dozuki saw that I used for small fine cuts to try and match the two lines together as much as possible, but the gap between the two original cuts really just left a mess. To cut the connector piece out, I tried smaller strokes, but that also went to the right more than I liked, so I needed to clean up both of those cuts with my shooting board. A few passes with my hand plane on each board cleaned them up to their respectively perpendicular cut I was originally going for. Now to lay out the connector board that will hold the top and the legs together. I need to create two 1-inch tenons by cutting away part of the side of the board. So I mark where they will be, and then how much of the area between the two of them I need to carve out. As I put in my Mox and vise to start cutting, a tip I figured out is that this vise works great when a piece is going all the way through it, but it does bind some if I use just the top for wide projects like this, since it's not very tall. So I add a scrap piece to the bottom to keep the vise having an even pressure across the total workpiece. I then cut the inside end of each of the tenons. The outside of the board will act as the outside of the tenon, as the connector board is only 18 inches long versus the top being a full 20 inches long. So it will sit under the top with a small lip where they connect on the ends. I use my coping saws to then cut out most of the bulk between the two tenons. After that, I used my chisel to set the line on both sides of the board, then started the process of removing the rest of the material to create a flat shelf for the top of the board to rest on. I now need to cut out the two mortises in the top of the board. I centered the board and marked the mortise locations, then cleaned up the lines with my speed square. For the first mortise, I decided to try it all by hand. After marking my lines, I started chiseling it out, which took way longer than I expected. In all, I spent close to 30 minutes on just this one mortise. For the second, I decided to try and drill out the bulk of the material. And then I cleaned up the sides and then chiseled out the ends. The drilling saved close to 15 minutes off the process for this side. I think it also turned out cleaner with sharper edges. And of course, the test fit doesn't go well, as the first ones never do. After several more iterations of test fitting and chiseling and test fitting and marking areas that are still tight and doing even more chiseling, the top finally fit with persuasion. And it was a nice tight fit too, but it turns out it was too tight. As I was pulling it apart, the tops of the tenons broke loose and snapped with the grain. I guess it's due to the pressure that was caused when the pieces were pulling apart because they were too tight. After fixing with glue and blue tape, it was time to move on to connecting the legs. I added a 45-degree cut to the bottom corners of the connector piece to try and make the final piece less boxy. I also went ahead and marked where I wanted the legs to go for each side. To cut the 45 degrees, since going across the board wasn't working well for me, this time I put the boards in the Mox vise and cut them vertically or down it. And this works much better. It made a nice straight cut. After repeating the cut on the other side, I decided to make another artistic change and add about a 10-degree slant to the legs, again hoping this would make the final product a little less boxy. I marked the center line for where the board should be, then marked the two outside lines based on the thickness of the legs, and then where I wanted the top of the cut to be, around halfway through the connector board. I then made two side cuts and chiseled out the waist pieces for both legs. This chisel work was a breeze going across the grain. Now it's time to cut the legs. You can make these as tall as you need, but I went with 21 inches for my height. I added the 10 degrees to this cut as this will be the bottom of the leg, and I wanted this to sit flat on the ground, offsetting the 10-degree angle we put in the connector board for the half-lap joint. Cutting down the board, I did not have a way to hold it so that I could go all the way through it. So I cut as far as I could, and then I flipped the board over and cut from the other side, continually checking to make sure I was on the line on both sides of the piece. This worked great as cutting down the board, I was able to keep a much straighter line than cutting across the board for some reason. I then measured how deep I needed to cut the half-lap joint on the leg to make sure the top of it would be level with the shelf we cut out on the connector board for the top board to sit on it. Then cut out the two sides and chiseled out the waist. This was much tougher than the connector sides, but it still came out nice and clean. Now for the final fitment touches, I smoothed out the top of the tenons and the shelf on the connector board to make sure the top board sat level and firmly on it. And now to connect the legs. The cut was too tight, so I chiseled away at the board to try and make space. But then I made another big mistake. I put too much pressure on the board when trying to test fit the leg and caused this section of the connector to break with the grain. So a quick glue up and some blue tape to hold it. I flipped the connector over and started the same process on the other side. I went ahead and added chamfers to both the connector and the legs and cleaned up both pieces. Then with a lot less force, worked both pieces until the leg fit. I then added chamfers with my block plane to most of the edges of the piece and used my chisel for areas I couldn't reach. After the other side of the connector dried, I repeated the same process on that side, and then it was time for the first mock-up. It all fit great, and it was really stable. Everything got touched at least twice while sanding, and finished with 220 grit, having to go by hand to hit a lot of those hard-to-reach places. I decided to keep it simple with the finish and just do a few coats of poly. My guest room has a Murphy bed in it that I built a few years ago, but there's no place in it for a lamp or to hold phones while people are sleeping. This side table would be great for when guests are here, and I can easily put it away when it's not needed. I'll likely also be using it as a stand for my tool chest or other projects as well, so it doesn't really have a specific style it needs to match, and it won't be permanent anywhere, so I can easily refinish it later if I need to change its tone. In all, a few lessons learned about watching the grain, but the side table turned out great. It's nice and sturdy, and it's easy to put away when it's not in use. That's going to do it for this build. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next build. Thanks!